Texas articulates with Louisiana. Okay? So today for the hip, I want to start off with giving you guys some so what. I'm all about so what. I'm all about how does this pertain to my everyday life, because to me the most interesting part about what I'm teaching you is that you can go out and apply it into your everyday life immediately. So what I'm about to talk about the hip, I want to preface, so important to balance. And balance is kind of one of those terms that we know what it is, but it's hard to define. It's basically maintaining your center of stuff, your center of mass, over your base of support, over what supports you upright. I must have gotten it right. So balance is very important. We take it for granted, most of us, until we have something wrong with us where our balance is compromised, and then we kind of take for granted what we have. But some people struggle with balance. Older people struggle with balance. People with vestibular issues. You have these little canals, these little semicircular canals, and basically what they are is they're little levels. You know, like carpenters use levels to keep the bubble in the. You got little bubble levels, and their whole function is to make sure that your eyes stay level. And if it doesn't, then it sends signals like, oh, go back, oh, go back this way. Kind of like the feedback loop, like a negative feedback loop. So for us, maintaining our center of mass over our base of support is extremely important. You cannot, unless you're holding on to something, but if you're holding on to something, then that's a new system. If you are just standing on your own and not holding on to anything, you cannot make your center of stuff pass outside of your base of support. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, Michael Jackson did it. You know what I'm talking about? Like when Michael Jackson, they had special shoes where they would land, they would have those hollow shoes and they'd hook them to connect them to allow them to lean forward. So unless your last name is Potter or Dumbledore, you can't make yourself go outside of your base of support. So my point is that your mass functionally lives inside of your base of support. Now, if you have 2 feet on the ground, you have a big base of support. If you have 1 foot on the ground, your foot is the base of support. That's why you're constantly waddling the teeter-totter, because you go too far, you're constantly kind of keeping it like that. You know what it is? It's no different than when you're driving. Even though you're going straight, you're constantly moving the wheel. You don't just keep the wheel straight, you're constantly adjusting. It's called undulating constancy, where you're just constantly fluctuating and moving. Now, to maintain your stuff over your base, your body has a couple different strategies in terms of joints. One of those is not your knee, because your knee can only kind of help sway you in one plane. But your ankle and subtalar joint, right? Your ankle and subtalar joint can help, and your hips. And that's what today's lecture is about, how your hips not only function, move, but how they really help with balance. So as we work our way up the chain here, we get closer and closer to our center of stuff, our center of mass. So if all we did was just move our ankles, in other words, rotate something by itself far away from our center of stuff, it doesn't take much because of arc distance to get our center of mass over our base of support and we fall over. Knee a little bit closer, but again, it doesn't take much of just knee motion. When you start to get to the hip, when you start to get to joints that are close to the center of mass, then you can kind of independently move it more without falling over. It's not that your mass goes beyond, it's just that as you do this, you can kind of sway a little bit other places to keep your mass over your stuff. Or if you pivot about one hip, the other leg goes out to act as a counterbalance so you can keep your mass over your base of support, okay? So the hip kind of allows, through strategies, this uni-motional stuff that the knees and the ankles don't. I can just move my hips, I'm moving my ankles a little bit, but not necessarily fall over. It's because it's closer to our center of mass, and all I gotta do is poke my booty out a little bit, and it cancels out, keeps my mass over my base, right? Now the hip joint itself, ball and socket is the classification, and that is the most movements allowable by that articulation. All three dimensions, all three planes. So how many motions are we going to have to account for? 6. 2 sagittal, 2 frontal, 2 transverse in anatomical position, and then I'm going to teach you a couple of variations once we get out of anatomical position. Now let's take a look at the articulation itself. First of all, a quick comparison. The shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, is a ball and socket as well. Some people kind of overthink it, and they're like, well, it's not a true socket. Dude, that's a socket. A little person is still a person. You know, they may be small, but they're still people. They're still us. It's the same thing. Even though a golf tee has a little socket, it's a socket. It's an articulation that a ball sits in. So I don't care that it's not as big as the hip. It's still a socket. The reason it's shallow is to allow more motion than the hip does, but it is still a ball and socket concept. Okay? Now, the trade-off here is motion versus stability. What you gain in stability, you lose in mobility. And what you gain in mobility, you lose in stability. It's a constant trade-off. You can't have something gained without sacrificing something else. Okay? So many analogies to use in life and in sport. But there must be a trade-off here. Now, for our hips, we want stability. Mobility isn't as important to us at the hips as it is in the shoulder. You know, being able to get your hand above to work, to pick food, to do things is functionally important. I don't need to get my feet up over my head unless I am in the circus. Stability, stability, stability. Think about this. If not in today's, we've had a couple students already that have come in with prosthetics, crutches and different things. We can make now, technology is amazing, prosthetics and orthotics and robot hands, like Star Wars stuff, we can do that. Our ancestors couldn't do that, man. We didn't have that tech. So we just have to remember design. And it doesn't matter which side of the coin you come from, it really doesn't matter. We evolved this way or we were made this way. It doesn't matter. The point is that our ancestors, if they dislocated this joint, they were done. Done. Anybody watch Animal Planet? And when the predators are going after the pack, do they go after the strongest, most physical ones? Heck no. Young ones, weak ones, sick ones, hurt ones, old ones. Chain is as strong as its weakest link. And humans, we are packs. We work in packs. We work in communities. We work in groups. There's a reason we have communities and cities, because we work together. And we do things together. And we build things together. And we trade things together. But if you have this bone come out of this socket, it's a bad, bad day. Not only for function, like an emergency, you're trying to get away from something, you got one leg, but for balance. It's kind of hard to function when your base of support only covers this much surface. Okay? There was no surgeries for that. There was no, and the irony is that your body puts so much redundancy in the stability of your hip that if it dislocates, it literally just shatters. Shatters everything. You got extra ligaments in there, and you got just the contour of that acetabulum. You got a lot of stuff in there to keep it stable, so when it does go, I like to think of it as like and I know this, the analogy is just for what happens to it. If you break open a graham cracker, it doesn't just it's all over the place, right? The yield point. It's not pliable for the hip, man. When you dislocate your hip, it's a bad, 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 bad day. So the point is that the body has extra insurance policies to rarely allow that to happen. Can it happen? Absolutely. Does it happen? Sure. Does it regularly happen? No. shoulder injuries all the time. Hip injuries, not so much. So the articulation of the hip joint. We have 2 segments, but technically 4 bones, okay? It's important. You need to know for your test the articulations that form the joint. If I'm asking you to know the hip joint, and you know that a joint is really just touching of segments, you gotta know the segments. Okay? Gotta know the segments. The first one's the easy one, the femur, right? This big, long, strong bone. Handles a lot of compression, so there's a lot of lattice work in here to help dissipate that force up and down the chain. And then you have this ball, this head, it's like half of a golf ball, right? And the socket that it articulates to is actually made from this bone called starts with an I. Ilium, yeah, the ilium at the top. If you want to think of it as dotting the I at the top, ilium. But then you got ischium, so then you're in a problem there. Ischium is in the back, and in the front is the pubis. So the reason, once again, why you have fused bones is when you're born, you're tiny. It kind of looks like a baby. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. And the reason you take so long to mature is because of this. It's because of our brains. So in other words, other animals that don't have the kind of brain power we have, they just have kind of instincts. They can be born and they go. Us, it takes time to learn all that stuff about our environment. So we have to grow slow into our brains. And so what our body does is that it has separate bones that can grow independently and cartilage that articulates them so that it allows to grow. Same thing with our pelvis. Man. Our pelvis now is a fraction of what we were born with. So it has to allow growth. And then once we grow to where we are, then it can fuse up. Then we weld it shut. Okay? So this pelvis, although we look at it as one segment, or you get fancy and say, well, you have a right and you have a left. It's 3 separate bones that were allowed to grow with you and then seal up. Then you stop growing. Okay? Ilium, ischium, pubis. So those 3 bones actually form. It's like if you I don't know why you do this, but you cut a pizza into thirds. You have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or a pie chart. So those 3 bones actually, all 3 form part of that socket. Okay? So femur into socket. A few things that make this joint extra strong. One is the socket itself. You have a deep articulation in there. It kind of helps hold it in place. The second thing is you have extra ligaments inside the hip that you don't have in your shoulder. Terry's ligament is one of them. You have these wide ligaments and ischial ligaments, and you just have a lot of ligaments. And remember, ligaments are just thickened parts of the capsule itself, except for that teres. That teres is an extra rope inside there. And the biggest reason you have extra stability at your hip is your muscles. Strong muscles like the hamstrings and rectus and the psoas. These muscles, as I'm going to teach you more in biomechanics, we typically just think of muscles in terms of motion. But muscles are so important to stability, keeping bones from translating out, preventing translation, and creating rotation. Okay? So in other words, we put a lot of energy into maintaining stability of this hip. Okay? A lot. So now we can talk about motion, and we're going to separate it in terms of planes. We have sagittal plane stuff, we have frontal plane stuff, and we have transverse plane stuff. Sagittal, in the feet, a lot of feet. Don't pay attention to my knee, even if my knee does something. If I'm talking about the hip, knee doesn't matter. So in other words, from my hip's perspective, this is the exact same motion as this. From my hip's like, I didn't do anything different. So what if my knee did something? It's on the knee. This is the same thing as this, from the perspective of the hip. So the hip can move in the sagittal plane. It's sagittal plane. It can help get me into fetal or out of fetal. That's going to be the easy one, right? Flexion, extension. I can extend from anatomical. That's not hyper. It's hyper if I go further than what my range of motion allows for, excessive. Now comes the frontal. So this is our first real dive into frontal plane motions. Subtalar kind of mostly is frontal, but remember that's a gliding joint. So it starts most, but then it kind of changes over, it goes more to that. So it's really kind of this combinational stuff. This is a true frontal plane road of motion. Okay? The way I like to teach the terms ab and adduction is to warn you. You have two words that sound ridiculously similar to each other. Anybody in here have a twin? Anybody in here? You have a twin? What are your names? So growing up, I had friends who were twins in my class, and their names was Keith and Keith. They look nothing alike, but we get their name, not until we got older, but because it sounded so close together, right? They weren't even identical, but just the name sounded close, so you go, I'm sorry, Keith. Ab and adduction, guys, they're twin motions. They're not the same. Twins aren't the same people. They're related. They're in the same family. But just think about it. Abduction, adduction. They sound so close that it's easy to get them switched. So for the purposes of this class, you're going to hear me say things like abduction, adduction, just to emphasize the syllable. Or I might do silly things like I'm warning you. Flexion, extension, two different sounding words. I mean, shun is the same, but extension, flexion. But ab and adduction, bro, that's brutal. So we need to be aware. Now, most people might be introduced to ab and adduction with terms like away and towards the midline. I don't teach it like that because when we get to the shoulder, my shoulder can go away from the midline, but guess what? It can keep traveling until it comes back towards the midline. And that can warp people's minds because the same motion is happening. In other words, if this was a clock hand, it would be going clockwise, 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 clockwise. But the first half I went away from a midline, and the second half I went towards a midline, but it was the same motion. So that freaks people out. So how I like to teach it is with clocks. Whether you have a normally functioning clock or a clock that functions the opposite way, you think of the arms and the legs as pointing to 6 o'clock, and abduction is rotation away from 6 o'clock. Because if you keep going, you're still going away from 6 o'clock until you get 12. Angular away, not linear away. So this whole midline thing, I know what they mean, and listen, in that bottom window it works. But what they're doing that I just, is they're taking a straight line function and applying it to a rotational world. And that could get us into trouble. So my point is that angularly, you guys remember where positive x is 0, right? Remember, angularly, if I do a whole 360, I actually get to where I started, but I'm actually 360 degrees away from where I started. But if you do it linear, you're like, oh, I'm back to where I started. This is all angular. Angular rotation away. Angular rotation towards. Okay? So, abduction, is going to be away from 6 o'clock. Adduction is going to be back towards 6 o'clock. And of course, there's always exceptions. When I say exceptions, using the whole away from 6 towards 6 is a way just to get down the spins, the rotations, okay? It's just to get down, if my arms do this, that's ab, and if they do this, that's ab. And it's a mirrored concept. It's not global, it's local. Once again, the doors open by spinning 2 different ways from the room's perspective, but they're both opening. So this is a mirrored concept. Ab, ab, da, 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 da. So the one exception is going to be when I can stand on this leg, start in anatomical, and adduct from anatomical. That's the one curveball, because you're like, whoa, you went away from 6 o'clock. So the whole away from 6 towards 6 is just to get you familiar with the directions of spin. And then once you're familiar with the direction of spin, the only thing that's stopping my arms from doing it is hitting the thorax. But there ain't no thorax right here. You can do this from anatomical. You can adduct from anatomical, but that's still adduction. Why? Because it's the same direction as rotation as this was. So again, it's nice to kind of have these layman reference terms, but at the end of the day, push comes to shove, down and dirty, it's about spin. It's about rotation of spin. Okay? Now, 4 main types of motion questions. It looks like it's moving and it is. It looks like it's not moving and it's not. It looks like it's moving but it's not. And it looks like it's not moving and it is. So before I get into the transverse plane, let's apply those different options to sagittal and frontal of the hip. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Left hip flexion, left hip extension, left hip extension, left hip flexion. 3-foot putt. Oh, a 3-inch putt. It looks like it's not moving, and it's not. Here's the illusions. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. Left hip, nothing. If I had a cast on my leg and I couldn't move my hip if I tried, if I pivoted about my right hip, my leg could go along for the ride. Basically what's happening is the socket and the ball are both doing this at the same time. However, if you hold on to references like, when I see the leg go this way, it's this. When I see the leg go that way, it's that. That's going to get you into trouble when it comes to these illusions. If you say, well, when the leg goes out, it's extension, well, here the leg went out globally, but no change in angle happened locally. It looked like it was moving, but it didn't. And the opposite's happening on the right side. It looks like it's not moving, but it did. But a lot of times we're introduced to motion with one segment moving about the other, but I've established over the last couple of weeks that I can have this, or I can have this. I can have this, or I can have this. It's not like the door and the wall, where only one segment moves about the other. This is the human body. We can move different segments about each other. So for this motion, I had right hip flexion and left hip nothing. It looked like my right hip didn't do anything because most people are only focused on that one bone. And you're like, I'm watching you, femur. Watching you. But I can have this, or I can have this. Any questions or clarifications? Let's go frontal plane. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Left hip ab, left hip ad. Ab, that's tight. Right hip ab, right hip ad. Looks like it's not moving, and it's not. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. Again, imagine I had a cast, and my left hip is in its anatomical position, and I pivot about my right hip. My leg could go away from 6 o'clock. The problem is, my clock hand didn't go away from 6. The whole clock did this, and it's still at 6. Yes? My finger points. Left hip ab. Left hip nothing. But if you hold on to global references, when I see the leg, it's not about a segment. It's about an articulation. It's not about one segment. It's about how one segment moves about another segment. It's a relationship between those two segments. Okay? Let's look at the illusion on the right side. Well, if my left hip did nothing, something had to move to make my left hip go out globally. Yeah, my right hip. My right hip actually went away from 6 o'clock. Now, it's not what we're used to. Used to, we just see the clock hand move. But there's no rule in biomechanics that can't say I keep the clock hand still and move that clock. So what happened is I kept my clock hand here, and I did this, and I went away. And then I come back, and then I went away, and then I come back. So I have right hip ab. Now, can I move my left hip? Yeah, absolutely I can. I could do it, but I don't have to do it. Any questions? Ooh, I got pulpity right there, man. Thought I was preaching. Let's pass the kid. Transverse plane. This is the harder one, and I'll tell you why. Because with sagittal and frontal, that's general motion. There's some aspect of linearity of bringing my leg up. But in the transverse plane, it's more pure rotation. In fact, to communicate that it's more pure rotation, right? In other words, it's spinning, but it's not going anywhere. The word rotation is in these words. That's how different apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer, flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, internal, external rotation. More pure, spinning, but not necessarily going anywhere. What's cool is that you have been introduced to these concepts with the knee. Hey, right knee, spin laterally. Hey, right hip, spin laterally. Right hip, spin externally. It's the same thing. Right hip, spin medially. Right hip, spin internally. Same exact rules. In a different place. Okay? Now, right hip external, right hip internal, left hip external, left hip internal. That's what it would look like if it looked like it was moving and it did. We're going to just jump straight to it looks like it's not and it is, it looks like it is and it's not. First of all, it should make some bit of sense. I just think this is cool. Let me come over here so everybody can see. I cannot bilaterally, internally and externally rotate with my feet fixed to the ground. I could do it if I pick my feet off the ground. But with my feet on the ground, I can't do the same thing. I can do opposite things. I can do opposite things. Let me try to help you understand this. if you're spinning a merry-go-round and you, let's say, Sarah, I hope you don't mind me using you as an example. Let's say we had kids on a merry-go-round, right? We're working with kids. Sarah and I cannot apply the same straight line force and spin that merry-go-round. Because if she pushes this way and I push this way, we're going to cancel out each other's rotation. So imagine the pelvis as being the merry-go-round, and the merry-go-round can spin this way or the merry-go-round can spin that way. We have to work in opposition. You have to apply your force this way, and I apply my force this way. Two different straight line forces, but guess what? We're creating the same rotational force. Does that make sense? That's how your hips work when your feet are on the ground. They work in opposition to spin the merry-go-round at your pelvis. Meaning that if I want to spin my merry-go-round this way, my left hip has to rotate differently than my right hip. And if I spin the merry-go-round the other way, they can't spin the same way because they cancel each other out unless my feet are off the ground. Okay? Someone had a question? I'm sorry. Someone had a hand go up, or was that just a stretch? Okay. Man, I'm seeing things, dude. Looking up too early. So, illusions. It looks like it's moving and it's not. Splint. What did my left hip do? Nothing. It looks like it did something. Your instinct is to be spin laterally, you got it? But I moved the ball and the socket, and there was no differentiation at all. But there was on my right. It looked like it wasn't, but it was. My right hip actually had external rotation. And one way to prove it, because again, I know your instinct is like, that gives me the fanfifons. It just don't feel right. I'm not telling you it has to feel right. I'm just trying to tell you what it is. Here's my start position. Here is my end position. How would I have to rotate my hip to go back home? Wouldn't I have to internally rotate it to go back home? So I had to externally rotate it to go away from home. Whether or not you see this or this, it's the same change. With my feet off the ground, right hip external rotation looks like this. But when my foot is on the ground, external rotation looks like that. It gets me to the same place. The hardest thing in the lower extremity to see, maybe knee rotation is tough too, is what I'm about to show you right here. When we move that merry-go-round, you baseball, softball people might be interested in this. When we move that merry-go-round, when we spin that merry-go-round, and we keep both feet on the ground. Now look, this isn't me teaching you about proper mechanics of hitting. I'm trying to teach you motion. You apply it the way you need to apply it. So I'm just giving you an example of if both feet are on the ground and I have to move my merry-go-round, these hips have to spin in opposition. Your instinct is to want to talk about rotation from the perspective of the merry-go-round. In other words, you see the merry-go-round spinning laterally, and your instinct is to say left hip external rotation, but that is wrong. Your left hip is internally rotating. See that? And it's your right hip that is externally rotating. Left hip internal, right hip external. Here's another way to see it. That's how it is. So again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to teach you why your brain wants to go down one road and try to recondition you by not assuming to say, whoa, 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 let me just make sure I'm seeing this right. And it's the same thing if I go the other way. This is not external rotation of my right hip. This is internal rotation of my right hip. Why do we not just say internal and external? I need to know that you know which one is doing what, right? So we communicate side, joint, motion. You have to tell me what the left is doing and what the right is doing. Okay? Guys, sometimes joints do the same thing. Sometimes they do, but they don't have to. They don't have to do the same thing. Here, they're not doing the same thing. Here, they're not doing the same thing. Okay, here's your last practice question. I start here, and I do this. Instead of spinning my pelvis like a merry-go-round, think of it as pouring water out the side of a bucket. Like if your pelvis is a bucket, and you pour water out the right side. What motions would have happened from my hips perspective if I started here and I did this? And if somebody out there can't see, just be like, and I'll come and move and show. So here's my merry-go-round. Instead of spinning it, we're going to tilt it. It's like a three-dimensional merry-go-round, one that could spin and wobble. And I'm not going to wobble, baby. Gave that up for Lent. I'm asking you about hip motion or hip position. Motion is just changing position. Where are my hips at and how did they move to get there? Where are my hips at and how did they move to get there? I'm going to give you a minute to, and listen, if you're introvert and you're like, oh my God, just talk to the voices in your head. That's what I do. But I want to give you a second to talk with a neighbor and say, this is what I'm getting. Is this what you get? Because what a great teaching moment. Because if you get something different, that allows you to try to work it out and see which perspective is more likely correct, okay? All right, 1 minute, discuss it.
What he just did. He just excluded.
All right, guys, the moment of truth. And listen, you either win or you learn. If you don't get it right, that's awesome, because it didn't cost you a thing. And the odds of you getting it right next time just went up exponentially, okay? So don't fear getting it incorrect at this point in the game, okay? All right, pour water out the right side. My left hip, I know this is rotation of ab, and this is the rotation of ad, So how would my left hip have to rotate to get me home? Wouldn't I have to ab, to go back to where I started? So my left hip adducted. I had left hip adduction. Let's go to my right. How would my right hip have to move to go back home? It would have to adduct to go back and meet the socket. So my right hip abducted. Here's another way to look at it. When I start an anatomical, I do this, My right hip is abducted. Added. So left hip added and right hip ab. And remember, I say silly things like ab and because ab and abduction sound so close together. And I just hear it so many times. I switched to ab and abduction. Yeah, dude, it's one letter and and I'm dyslexic. Like that just freaks me out. So use things like AB, AD, emphasize that letter. Use the thing that could be confusing, wear it like a badge of honor, and identify it so that you don't miss it. Any last questions? Reminder, guys, emails, man, that's how I'm going to officially communicate with you guys. I'm going to post a lecture for Friday. It may be Friday, it may be Saturday. It's going to be this weekend for you to watch on your own time, okay?